Good morning, everyone. Give it a second or two here to let people come in from the waiting room, get connected to audio. If you can hear my voice, fantastic. Your audio works. All right, so we will go ahead and get started. So good morning. My name is Brittany Boston, and I am with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support. In the realm of non-credit world, you have seen my face and heard my voice, helping support some of the new learning communities that we have going on for you all, as well as professional development. This is Patty's second webinar in this series. And so our role as ICSPS is supporting ICCB and supporting non-credit programs when it comes to professional development. So thank you for joining us this morning. I do just want to give you a few reminders and housekeeping things. We are in Zoom meeting. And so with Zoom meeting, you have the ability to turn your camera on. You have the ability to unmute yourself, ask questions, make comments. But we do just want you to be mindful that this is being recorded. And so if you'd rather your camera not be on while this is being recorded, we do just want to make sure you're aware of that. And then if you have to step away, just be mindful of turning the camera off and making sure that mute button is on. I will put a link in the chat to some information about the Strategies at Work conference, as well as where you can find the recording and resources for this webinar series and additional professional development items that we have done and will continue to do throughout the fiscal year. And throughout today's presentation, if you have questions, comments, you can utilize the chat. I'm sure Patty will have moments where she pauses and asks if anyone has any feedback. You can come off mute if you have a working microphone. We would love to hear from you, however best works for you. And so with that, I am going to hand it over to our presenter, Patty Zuccarello.
Thanks, Brittany. Welcome, everyone. I was going to say welcome back if this is your second webinar with me. If this is your first, welcome. Today, we're going to be talking about how to get on the non-credit to credit transition framework using collaboration as the primary tool. So I realize that we do a lot of collaborative work in higher ed. However, I feel like sometimes we don't use the most intentionally designed models to make it the most successful version of collaboration. So that's what we're going to really look at today. So I thought I would start by just talking about the framework one more time, and then a little bit about where I see collaboration hitting pieces of the framework. And then from there, we're going to talk about how to really intentionally identify and engage stakeholders at your institutions, and using this model of collaboration that's called co-creation. Those of you who have degrees in higher ed leadership, or even honestly in marketing, have probably heard of this idea before. So we're going to kind of explore that a little bit more and talk about kind of how you would go about doing that, what that all looks like. And then one of the pieces I feel like is really key when we're talking about non-credit and credit collaboration is working with your faculty unions if your institution is a union environment. So I'm going to point to just a little bit of language that seems relatively common in faculty union contracts, and think about kind of how that intersects positively with projects such as non-credit to credit transition, but also may provide some pain points as you're thinking through the process. So that's kind of where we're going to go. And then, of course, resources and next steps. So let's start by just taking another look at the non-credit to credit framework that we're using in Illinois. So again, the framework basically has these three buckets. So the first phase is where you'll pick a starting point for your adventure. And if you look at these items, again, you would just pick one of these as a starting point. They all have collaborative elements kind of embedded in that work. Many of you focused on bridging tools as your starting point. So the example that I'm using in today's adventure is about a bridging tool project that I worked on, but you'll see that collaboration is really key in any of these kinds of starting points that you pick. you're not going to be able to do any of these things on your own. You're going to have to involve other divisions and other functional areas inside your institution. So that's why we're kind of thinking about this collaborative idea today. When you move to the next phase, once you've selected a starting point and now you're laying the groundwork, you can see the very first thing you need to do is engage stakeholders. So right there, collaboration is kind of front loaded into that next piece. Although you'll see it kind of all throughout there, right? Like, especially when you're talking about things like looking at your institution's culture or aligning internal operations to make this all work better. Those are all collaborative pieces that you're going to work through. And then finally, the last phase, once you're actually building and implementing your pathway, then you need to really manage that change. And again, to me, how easy that final phase goes has a lot to do with the collaborative groundwork that you lay in phases 1 and 2. So as I was starting to think about this, I thought you might also be kind of interested in seeing the survey results that we worked on in webinar 1. So this was the first question where we looked at the phase 1 starting points and asked you to identify which are the tools that you think you're going to use. So you'll notice the number 1 answer was actually, we're still trying to figure it out. But the number 2 answer was developing bridging tools. So that's really what we're going to be talking about today. And then the second phase, when we asked which pieces have you implemented, I was really delighted to see that so many of you had already started with the stakeholder engagement piece. That's going to be a huge piece to the success of this project. And then again, these ideas around institutional culture and aligning operations, all of those pieces are really about how you collaborate and how you think about ways to move students around in your institutions. And then finally, the last phase of really managing the change, articulating the vision was where you guys were most heavily concentrated. But again, thinking through how we support implementation has a lot to do with how we collaborate with one another. So the story I was thinking about when I was thinking about co-creation and bridging was a project I worked on that was looking at credit for prior learning. And I noticed several of you noted that as the way that you're going to do the bridging, right? Is thinking about either refreshing a policy, writing a stronger policy. The project that I worked on, we had an existing policy, but we didn't love it in terms of how it moves students from non-credit to credit. We felt that it was very kind of top down in orientation. So the folks that actually had to implement the policy and procedure didn't really have any input into how it worked. So we wanted to change that. We also noticed that it was very narrow in focus. So it applied to very few pathways instead of thinking about how we could kind of open it up and make it more available to more students and kind of more pathways at the institution. It was also really reliant on testing as a way to demonstrate proficiency. And again, we felt like we could do better. And then it also required that students complete 15 hours of coursework at the college before we were able to transcript prior learning. And we thought that was also kind of a barrier. And then, but really the biggest barrier was it was the best kept secret on campus. It was very hard to find out if students were eligible. If you were a student trying to use this policy, it was hard to find, and it was hard to then figure out how to work your way inside the bureaucratic processes of the institution. So looking at that policy and procedure, we kind of made a wish list. So that's this middle bucket here. So we really wanted to involve the stakeholders and have them really create this thing. And as part of that, we wanted to make sure that we used a very wide focus about how we conceptualized prior learning. And that because of that, we were then able to use multiple methods to assess prior learning, not just a standardized test. And then ideally hoping that that would really create more pathways across industries and then a stronger ramp to credit for students. And then really the other piece of this was whatever we ended up doing, we wanted to make sure that it was going to be public and not secret, and that students would easily find it and that staff could easily talk about it and implement it and provide it as an option. So that was sort of the wish list. And then we started gathering stakeholders. So on this stakeholder group, you'll see probably some usual suspects, right? Like you're talking about a curriculum process. You really can't do that at a higher ed institution without involving the faculty. So that was kind of the first stop on the hit parade. And then we also wanted to figure out which groups of administrators needed to be involved, and we pulled from credit and non-credit for that. We pulled in advising, enrollment, financial aid. We actually even had institutional research because we wanted to pull data and see what we were already doing and what we might need to do differently. And then kind of toward the end, we pulled in marketing to help us think about how to place this new product in front of students. And then I also listed Academic Standards Committee on here. Most colleges have a variety of shared governance committees. So that the name of that committee may be different at different institutions, but this is the group of faculty that kind of comes together to manage the overall kind of framing of curriculum and how it operates at the institution. So these were kind of all the moving parts that we were trying to work through. So as I started to think about that project and this project, I kind of pulled from it the pieces I thought could be helpful as you're trying to do a non-credit to credit transition at your institution. Oops. So the first thing I thought would be helpful was when we thought about collaborating, we had to think about like, what are the curbs for collaboration? And really, I think the best thing you can do when you try to collaborate is set really broad curbs. So the way that we wanted to work together was the thing that we were going to build needed to have value for all the stakeholders at the table, which again can be kind of a different thing in how versus how we normally operate. I think a lot of times when we make a decision, it's sort of like this is the group that's going to win, and this is the group that kind of loses on this thing. And we didn't want to have that. We really wanted to build something where everybody at the table was a winner, like everybody got value out of whatever we designed. I should also probably mention here, this process ended up taking almost 2 years from start to finish because of some of these curbs and because of some of our values. So just be advised, you may be in this for quite the long haul, but that's okay. So we wanted to have that value piece. We also didn't prescribe how we were going to get there, right? So we knew what the issues were and we knew what the wish list was, but how we were going to get there was kind of up for grabs. Like that was really where this co-creation idea comes in, is it's not going to be top down where the president, the vice president, the dean is going to issue the edict and then, we do this by fiat. It really is going to be how the group designs it is going to be how we do it. So there's that piece. And then kind of connected to that is this other curve, which was we wanted to just build a really large inclusive table for folks to come around. So we started out by inviting the kind of the usual suspects. But as we started to think through this process, and like I said, it took almost 2 years to do this whole thing, we invited additional people to the table, especially if we were looking at a particular function and thought we're going to need more support and more information about this piece at the college. So you can also have people who are at the table all the time, and then you can have these kind of ad hoc folks that you invite in for kind of, special guests with special gifts. And then the other piece that we wanted to do is to make sure that folks were able to talk about the project, not just at the official meetings, but other places. So if folks wanted to have kind of exchanges through email or exchanges in Teams, or if they wanted to meet and have lunch, like however the group kind of wanted to move the collaboration effort forward was okay with us. So those were kind of the big curves. One of the things I think is interesting to think about is sort of what kind of culture does your organization have? And that culture is going to either really support this non-credit to credit collaboration effort, or it's going to be a bit of a hindrance. So there are a variety of thoughts out there about organizational culture. This particular one I took from a Forbes article that I read and thought, like, yeah, I kind of feel like this rings true for me. So hopefully this will kind of ring true for you too. So in this model, there are these four types of organizational cultures. So the first one is adhocracy. So in that culture, you kind of thrive on innovation, fast pace, problem solving on the fly, kind of going with your gut, risk taking, all of those kinds of pieces. That's adhocracy. Clan culture is more about if you're at an institution that likes to describe itself as a family, you may be at a clan culture institution. So the priority here is really collaboration across functional areas, using trust more than kind of data in some cases to move ideas forward. And often new ideas get a little bit boondoggled in a clan culture because you're fighting against kind of the honored history if you're trying to make changes. So that's that piece. Market culture is if you're really looking more at how you can be the best in your industry and how you can kind of beat the other colleges at something that is happening. And that could be anything from like you want to be the college that has the greatest gain in enrollment this year to, you're going to roll out this new program before any other college does it. You may be a market culture. And then finally, hierarchical culture is exactly what it sounds like, where it really kind of values the chain of command, and that really you need to adhere to this chain of command in order to get things done or to kind of move things along. So all four of these cultures look at kind of internal versus external market forces, and they also look at kind of flexibility versus control. And it's just sort of a range of how much flexibility you get and versus control, and how much you look at external versus internal values in your culture. So if you had to, right now, just knowing only what I just said, put into the chat, do you think your adhocracy, clan, market, or hierarchy as your college's culture? And I won't, I'll react to what you're putting, but I won't name the institution since we're recording. Yeah. So I feel like we see a lot of hierarchy, we see a lot of clan. I think it's interesting that some of you are noting you may be a hybrid where you may be hierarchy with some clan in, right? I do think that's very common. I think one of the things that's interesting is I don't see a lot of adhocracy and I don't see a lot of market culture. And in many ways, what we're asking you to do with non-credit to credit transition is really going to be kind of heavy on adhocracy and market culture. So that's something, yes, to be aware of. I see a lot of hierarchy. Yeah. And then, but kind of know that that's your culture and be thinking about what does that mean in terms of collaboration. Traditionally, in hierarchical organizations, it's really going to be about following policy and procedure and making sure you're checking all those boxes in whatever the kind of process wish list that your institution has. Yeah, I think hierarchy is really strong in our institutions. Thank you all for participating in that. I know that can be potentially fraud. One of the other pieces that I feel like in our situation came up, and having spoken with some of you, I feel like this may be coming up for you too, is working through difficulties with colleagues. And I think sometimes we chalk it up to kind of personality differences. But I actually think there's this other piece at play, and it's this thing called cooperation competition paradox. And I feel like hopefully this resonates with you. This just had my brain on fire as I was reading more about this. So this idea of cooperation versus competition, it's sort of this continuum that we live on. And inside this continuum, there are these three kind of intrinsic tensions. So the first one is fairness versus opportunism. And this is really kind of, I think, the configuration that we run into probably most frequently. And it's trying to kind of figure out how we feel about somebody else's share of the pie. So do we feel like it's fair and equitable, kind of how they're getting handled or what they're getting to have as resources? Or are they kind of, our perception is more they're being opportunistic in how they're kind of using resources at the institution? So there's that piece. Then the next tension is this rivalry versus engagement. And it's sort of trying to figure out, like, internally, when are we feeling like we're competing with each other? And when are we truly working collaboratively as a team? And that kind of tension can exist in any function at your institution. But I feel like, especially when we're talking about non-credit to credit transition, there's a lot of this kind of tension between workforce education and maybe credit, career, and technical education. That these two sides of the same coin aren't really feeling like two sides of the same coin, but that there's some rivalry going on between them there. And then this third intrinsic tension is about controlling versus sharing. So thinking about anything, whether it's resources or information, do we tend to kind of control that and keep it to ourselves, or do we tend to kind of push it out and share the wealth, whether it's actual wealth or informational wealth? And what this design really stresses is the way to push through this paradox is to continually point towards fairness, engagement, and sharing. That those three pieces together will always get you the best outcome in any given project or situation. Now, that's easily said, not necessarily easily done. So I was, again, thinking about how do we get here, right? How do we get to a collaboration that's really rooted in fairness, engagement, and sharing? And I was thinking about an experience I had doing a contract negotiation where we used interest-based bargaining. Some of you know, if you know me, you know I kind of have a fixation about using interest-based bargaining. It like kind of for more than just union contracts, but really in any situation where you've kind of got that competition paradox, is to think about how to use interest-based bargaining in that space to move you through the boondoggle and get to this idea of fairness, engagement, and sharing. So for those of you who are less familiar with interest-based bargaining, it sort of starts off by kind of surfacing what are the individual or departmental concerns that you're trying to address. And it can be kind of two ways, right? It could be like, we're going to implement this non-credit to credit, or in our case, like this prior learning assessment project. What are the individual concerns different departments may have about this, right? And that could be everything from like, how do you transcript the credit, to faculty concerns about how you actually determine how many credits things are worth, right? So kind of surfacing those first and encouraging folks to tell the stories and give the history, which again, I think if you're kind of either hierarchical or especially clan culture, telling stories about what happens at your institution and giving the history of like back in the day we tried this, da da da. I think becomes really important. So this idea about interest-based bargaining and kind of sharing background and history allows you to then move forward and get to this next piece, which is what is our common ground? What are our common goals? And then kind of connected to that, what are the mutual interests we have around those goals and the project success? And once you kind of have these mutual interests identified, then you brainstorm options that could potentially address those interests. So you may have an interest where we want to make sure that students can easily transition from non-credit to credit programming. That could be a mutual interest. And then we brainstorm options for how we could get there. And don't put barriers on it. When you're brainstorming, it's no holds barred. You'll eventually then go back and kind of review, reject, amend, or adopt those brainstormed ideas until you kind of get down to a handful of items that really can be things you can really adopt as part of your project. So this to say, I cannot recommend highly enough using this idea of interest-based bargaining to figure out what your actual project could really look like. So now that we've chatted a little about collaboration, I want to talk a little bit about stakeholder engagement. This is another one of my favorite things. Jobs to be done is another framework. It's Clayton Christensen and his team coined this phrase many moons ago, but it's thinking about what you're basically being hired to do with any particular product. So, like if we think about non-credit to credit transitions, what is the job that that transition is performing for students? And then also, what is the job that transition is performing for employers in your region? And what is the job it's doing for the college? So, kind of thinking about non credit to credit transition as a product that really fills a need in these three different markets. And I think when we start to kind of think about non-credit to credit transition as a job to be done, it helps us bring pieces into focus that sometimes we forget to consider. So for example, I intentionally put what is the job it does for students first, because throughout this whole piece, I feel like it becomes easy to identify the benefits for the college and for employers, but I feel like the students will be hiring you to do this job for them, right? So, like, what is the job students are really getting done from using a non-credit to credit transition? And I just feel like it's a kind of a better way to look at it, right? Like, if we just sort of think about what the individual, the employer, or the college is really hoping to achieve by this transition. So, in the chat, pick any of these three buckets. I'm kind of biased towards the student one, but I won't make you do that one. You can do any of them. When you think about non-credit to credit transition, what's the job to be done that you're basically being hired by students to do for you by having a non-credit to credit transition? What are the employers basically hiring you to do when you provide a non-credit to credit transition? And then what is the college really hoping you'll be doing for them by having a non-credit to credit transition? So pick any of those three ideas and put in the chat what you think is the job that non-credit to credit is doing. And if you can, kind of write out like what is the actual job itself, right? So like the job the college may be hiring you to do via non-credit to credit transition is to increase the number of credit and non-credit completers. Do you get where I'm going? Yeah, Joel, I see you. And I think you're on the money on that one, really. The I think where so Joel's idea about what is the job that employers are hiring us to do with non-credit to credit transition. So Joel's arguing it's this idea about having upward mobility. I think the other piece too with non-credit to credit transition is for employers, it sort of takes away the jargon from them getting their folks trained. One of the things that has come up for me as I've been talking to some employers about non-credit and credit is they're not really into, I'm sure you all know this, the label of non-credit or credit. They're really into what is the skill set being developed. So I actually think the job they're hiring us to do with non-credit to credit transition is to kind of take the noise away when they're trying to get somebody trained. Yep. And then I see other things too about like college is hiring you to increase enrollment and retention as the job to be done, to increase the number of students entering the credit stream, completing degrees and certificates. Yes. Right. Yep. And then thinking about the students, removing barriers, making a seamless transition. You guys are great. This is great. Yes. Multiple ramps for on ramps for students, internal linkages for the benefits of students and employers. Yes. Yes. These are all great. Yes. So when you're thinking about these pieces, these jobs to be done become kind of those marching orders that you're going to use with your collaborative group, right? That all of when you sit down and you start thinking, what are all the jobs to be done for these different stakeholders and kind of program users, right? So, what do students want? What do employers want? What does the college want? Yes, yes, yes. Yep. Great. Okay, great. And then this thing next then is thinking about like, okay, we know what the jobs are we want to be done. We now need to kind of think about what is the stakeholder group that we want to engage. And granted, usually and typically, this session is really going to be more about internal stakeholders. But I do find when we think about external stakeholders, we do kind of fall into one of these, excuse me, 5 levels of engagement, where the first level is basically not relational, kind of transactional at best. Um, that stakeholders, I call that one, what's a stakeholder? And really, it's trying to figure out what somebody needs, but without really involving them in the process. The next layer beyond that is what I'm calling let me read your mind, which is we know there are stakeholders. We're going to figure out what they want without going to them directly. You may see this if you're involved on advisory committees. I feel like a lot of times we do kind of like an information fire hose where the institution kind of gives information out to the employers but doesn't ask for a lot back. And then a different kind of further down on the continuum place is surveying folks. So at least we're getting some information. But these first 3 buckets, the issue really there is that it's not really relational. It's still kind of unidirectional instead of bidirectional communication versus these two over here further on the continuum, actually having discussions and getting meaningful feedback from your stakeholders is really going to help you develop a way better product. And then finally, product co-creation to me, again, is kind of like the gold standard holy grail of how we engage stakeholders. So again, usually this kind of level of engagement we use as when we're looking at external stakeholders, but I feel like we can also use this when we're looking at internal stakeholders. Because again, I think often we don't necessarily think about the other areas of the college as stakeholders in our work, but this gives us a way to kind of think about that, right? So if we think about internal stakeholders using these 5 levels of engagement, moving from what the heck is a stakeholder towards how we can co-create this product with our stakeholders, you can see right there, you're going to get a much different product, ideally more effective product, by doing deep work with your stakeholders. I won't ask you to tell me which level you're at in this one. Although sometimes I do have fun with that, but no. So once you're starting to think, we want to move towards this idea of co-creation and away from this, what is a stakeholder piece? How do you actually get from point A to point B? So the way you do it is you need to identify your groups. So start thinking about who are the groups that you want to invite to your table. And then thinking about jobs to be done. When you make the pitch to invite these people to the table, you're going to maybe want to do two things. The first is to say, here's what I think could be the job to be done for your group by joining us in this project. And then also, what is the ask you have of that group? Because you're asking the stakeholders to come to the table because you think there's something in it for them, but also they have information, specialization, skills, knowledge that you don't have and the group needs. So when you make the ask, make sure to include, here's how I think this could benefit you, and also this is how I need you to benefit us. And then really, once you have that group together, look through it and then see, are there any deficiencies? Who are we missing? Who's not at the table? And again, you can continue to iterate your stakeholder list. It does not need to be kind of a static one and done list, but think of it more as like a living thing that continues to develop as the project continues to develop. And then once you have your group together, then you can start to create those performance indicators. So again, like for our project, thinking about where we were with prior learning, where we kind of would like to land in terms of values, if not specific tasks. Those specific tasks are kind of what the group builds then over time. And there are a lot of these kind of tools online to help you do stakeholder mapping. But I think for me, the way this is sort of helpful is just trying to think about like the non-credit to credit program or project is kind of the core. And then who is going to help with that is going to be the core users of that program, which can be students, faculty, staff across those functional areas. It can be employers, although I tend to put employers more into the more like direct stakeholder group more than the core user. The core users are going to be people who are really looking at non-credit to credit transition or participating in non-credit to credit transition as kind of part of their daily life at the college. And then again, kind of circling, pushing out, thinking about those direct stakeholders more as maybe industry partners, other college administrators, the college as a whole, and then indirect stakeholders is kind of the larger community industry partners who maybe aren't direct stakeholders of this particular project, but maybe are still in your sphere of influence, the Chamber of Commerce, that's kind of that larger bubble. Okay, so if we're thinking about stakeholders, can you think of one functional area at your institution, or if not a functional area, a role? Try to use the role and not the person's name. And just like who would you want to include as an internal stakeholder? And then when you think about that functional area or that person's role, what would you say is kind of the value, the why, the job to be done for why you would ask them to participate in your non-credit to credit collaboration? And then what's the expertise that you're hoping they would bring you to the collaboration? So what's your ask? So functional area, the job to be done, and the ask that you hope the expertise they're going to bring. And then put that in the chat. Thanks, Jill. Right. So thinking about who, especially if you're bringing new positions into the institution, right? Kind of like who they are, what the role is, how you kind of see that intersecting. So bringing in a director for non-traditional programs, hoping that they would really be able to provide leadership guidance, direction, vision for this kind of project as you move forward. Yeah, that's a great idea. And then Kristen, yep, deans and faculty, yes. So we're going to talk a lot about faculty in a minute here. Co-creating the instructional pieces, absolutely. Subject matter expertise, yeah, yep, yes. And I think this idea too, Kristen, about thinking through how the organizational culture impacts kind of the process of the ask too, and kind of who's included. So you may start by inviting a lot of administrators, and then you realize over time that it really becomes more a faculty driven mechanism. That in our case, that was definitely true, where we realized over time that the leadership of it, kind of the maintenance of our prior learning, had to really be held at the faculty level. So I think that's things you find along the way. Um, Christina, yes, including the testing center. Yeah, yeah, definitely, right. And then thinking about why we would like to include them, and then ideally this idea about like kind of multiple measures of assessments, but then also they kind of bring this their existing knowledge about PLA. Yeah. Oh yes, Sydney. Yes, the registrar. We did a lot of work. There was a staff person in enrollment services that actually did transcription of various existing prior learning and CLEP and AP and IB and all of that kind of stuff. And she was fantastic on our committee because she could really kind of think about even just like coding in the system, things that I would not be thinking about, right? So thinking through those pieces. Yeah. And then including, so Kathy, including the vice chancellor of academic affairs. Yeah. Thinking about like, again, how the mechanisms work at your institution for sure. Lori, thinking about the CT career specialist. That's great. Yeah. You guys, yeah, financial aid. Great. You guys have tons of good ideas. These are all great ideas. And again, the thing to keep in mind is what is the functional area you want to include? What do you think is the job to be done? And once you start explaining the program, folks will come up with additional jobs to be done that you didn't think of. And that's perfectly fine. Like, that's great. Add them all in. And then again, what's that expertise that they bring that you don't have? And so for me, I made just kind of a list. Note, this is not a complete list. But again, just kind of thinking about many of these you already kind of thought about, but also just be thinking too about things like marketing, right? I noticed in some of your reporting that you're trying to figure out how you really roll out this kind of project to students or to other stakeholders. And like one of those early pieces of managing the change is really about communicating the vision. And I think the marketing folks have a different way of thinking about messaging that can be helpful. So keep them in mind. Okay, so let's chat about this idea of co-creation. So like I was saying, one of the things that I really like about co-creation is there's no losers at the table. Everybody gets value from the project. Now, that's not the same as everybody gets exactly what they want. Everybody ends up getting options that they can support. So not just options they can live with, it's like a little bit better than that. So the goal is that these are going to be options you can support, and that each stakeholder has a piece of value now from this co-created product. And because we're looking at value, the emphasis, although most of your work is going to be on the process of getting it done, the emphasis is really on the end result. So like, where do you really land? And then the other piece too about co-creation is that the stakeholders are interacting with each other directly, not up and then down. Like I feel like, again, in hierarchical organizations, a lot of times we bring our beefs up a level and then they talk about it up here and then they kind of rain down a fiat. That's not what this is going to be. This is literally like stakeholders are interacting directly and working through their issues, person to person at that level. And then you, as the organizer, or as I'm calling it here, the initiator, will provide some loose curbs about what we're trying to accomplish. But really, in the co creation, the group really designs what is going to be that end result and kind of how are we going to build that and how do we get there from here. So, and I feel like it's sometimes helpful to think about like how we traditionally do things versus kind of a co-creative design. So like in more traditional strategies, it's more we're going to build this thing and then we're going to deliver it to the customer. We've made a single goal, like we're going to sell this many credit hours, and it doesn't really change or modify. For the most part, the interest is about how this benefits the college interests and how we can kind of like either outperform competitors or how we can kind of outperform our performance last fall, last spring in enrollment or revenue, right? Co-creation is really focusing more on the experiences of the stakeholders and using goals that can change. Goals can evolve as the team continues to evolve and refine things and find new information and figure things out together. But the emphasis is really on those stakeholders and the mutual interest that they kind of elevate through the process. So that's really to me the difference is this like co-creation is really this kind of lovely thing that happens in the group when you really give the group the power and the tools to design something that they feel can work best for all of the stakeholders combined. So I told you at the beginning about my PLA scenario, right? And really, what we ended up doing was we did create something that had a much wider utility for more students. And we focused heavily on alternative methods instead of being heavily test reliant. So we really started looking at like, what are all the different credentials that we teach on the non-credit side? How do those things come over and get awarded as credit on the credit side? What are things that we don't teach at the college, but we're aware of other kinds of training entities in the area may be providing? And then what does that come over as? So really kind of doing this environmental scan to identify a maximum number of kind of ways students could really opt into this larger framework. And because of that, then it hit numerous industries. So we weren't looking really narrowly anymore, but we went from serving maybe 2 to 3 industries to now we were probably serving 20 different possible pathways. We also figured out a way to award the credit at the beginning of the student's journey, not 15 hours in. And I'll talk more about that in a second. And then we also, because of this, created a committee whose task it was to review the landscape and then update what was involved in prior learning assessment year after year, because that seemed to be a way to institutionalize it and keep it kind of current and a living, breathing kind of thing. And then as we also walked through it, we realized we started running into things we hadn't really thought about. Like if a student gets some transcripted prior learning credit and then they end up doing like a 3+1 and they transfer out, that receiving institution may or may not accept that credit. So we started working with our transfer folks and having that piece getting written into those MOUs so that students knew they had better assurance when they were doing that. So that was a big piece of kind of a surprise to us. Like we hadn't really thought about that. And then it was one of the members, one of the stakeholders who pointed out that that was going to be an issue. And So we addressed it. And then finally, again, the marketing folks helping us think about student facing language and how sometimes when we explain things in higher ed, we explain it using our kind of jargon language instead of plain language for students. So, and again, I feel like that's where your marketing folks can really help out. So for us, it was a really great process. I feel like the other piece that we learned so much more about what everybody does at the institution. And I also think you got all these other benefits, like now you had actual relationships with people in all these different offices around the college instead of just knowing who somebody was and saying hi in the hallway. You actually had, because we'd worked through this for almost 2 years, relationships with people. So if you really needed help on something else, or you had another case with a student that was unrelated, you had somebody you could really go to. And I think it really made a lot of things more pleasant at the institution. So can't recommend that enough. The 15 credit hour thing, I did want to kind of circle back to that. At the time that we were working on the project, we had some early old language from the ICCB's manual that had this language about 15 credit hours had to be completed prior to awarding PLA. The more current language does not have that, but I feel like many institutions are still pointing back to that old language. So if you're doing prior learning assessment as your non-credit to credit transition, one of the first things I would do is check out what your current policy is and see if it's really still pointing back to kind of old language instead of current ICCB language on PLA, which says that you can award it at any point during the application and admission process. So for a lot of these courses that we were looking at for prior learning assessment, they would have been those kind of intro courses. So for us not to be able to award that credit until students had already done 15 hours, there would have been almost no point in many instances. So that was a real important thing for us to kind of work through and figure out. And the new language allows everybody to do that. So this to say, check your policy and see if you may be pointing to old language instead of modern language. Okay, and now the moment you've all been waiting for, potentially, union agreements and how this kind of intersects. So often I think we don't do some kinds of non-credit to credit transition work because we think the union prohibits it. And in some cases, it's not exactly as dire as we think. And in some cases, maybe it is. For the most part, when we look at contracts and think about like what is really prohibited, generally speaking, there's a piece that kind of protects curriculum in that you can't teach something that could be taught on the credit side. And often it's kind of this sort of language. So like no outside institution can offer any course in the college's facility that a credit academic department could offer. So sometimes it says no outside institution. Sometimes it says like no other division. So your contract has something probably in it that looks a little bit like this. There's usually also a clause that protects faculty work in terms of no positions being created that look like they could have basically been a full-time faculty member. So this to say, you probably, if you look at your union contract, will see something under the curriculum section about this first bullet, and then something under faculty protected work as this kind of second piece. But really, the faculty are, as many of you have already noted, are intimately connected to the curriculum. So I kind of prefer, instead of focusing on like what the contract won't let you do, maybe focus more on like the ways in which the contract kind of aligns with what we're trying to do. So one of the places you can really see it is when you look in the union contract under the curriculum section, you'll see all these kind of curriculum rights that faculty have about how they have the right to participate in policies and procedures affecting academic matters. Often this gets routed through various committees at your institution. But then they also are tasked with developing curricula that respond to the needs of the community. And that includes local industry as well as transfer institutions. So I feel like that's kind of in the zone for what we're trying to do. And then I also think most contracts have, because I took this literally from one of the contracts I was looking at, have clauses in there about professional development, faculty developing new curriculum, faculty getting release time or reassigned time to do this. So some of your, if you look at your contract, some of you are going to see there are places where faculty are already kind of tapped to lead the charge on some of these initiatives. And then I also found some kind of outlying language that I thought could be interesting. So, like one of the contracts I looked at also even allowed for non-credit coursework that was not like kind of personal interest coursework. So anything that had one of these PCS codes could then be used towards their faculty load. So if you're one of the schools that allows that, then in some ways this is great because whatever you end up designing, you could already tap into the faculty to help you design it, and then they could actually be the instructor for the pieces and parts. Or you could maybe, if it doesn't come directly as load, could maybe go in through other faculty assignments, could potentially be another mechanism to kind of enhance student involvement in the area. I also noticed several contracts that did either faculty seminar or learning communities for faculty, which again is another way to kind of incentivize getting faculty involved in your project and then compensating them for their time and effort on the project. But overall, when you're working with a union contract, you definitely don't want to guess that you're doing something or not doing something right. So you want to find somebody who knows the contract and ask them. That tends to be the executive board of the union, in my experience. So if you or like really, in all honesty, find the grievance chair of your union because that's probably the person who knows the most about what works and won't work. And as you're building your stakeholder team, if you can include union leadership, do it. In our project, we ended up including union leadership totally by accident, just because the union leadership was a faculty member in one of the areas that was interested in looking at prior learning assessment. So ended up being a great thing. I would totally advise you for that. And then also thinking about all of the shared governance committees on campus that touch curriculum in some way. And that can be anything from like academic standards, faculty senate, to your actual curriculum committee. Think about how you want to loop those folks in and invite them to be shareholders in your non-credit to credit movement. And then before you go, I also just wanted to put these couple of things back on your radar. So our next webinar won't be until the end of January. So enjoy your winter breaks and Happy New Year's. And I will see you again the end of January. In February, we'll be together in real person at the Strategies at Work conference. And there will be some sessions there about non-credit to credit transitions. So definitely keep an eye out for those. And then our fourth webinar will be in April, where we'll really talk about scaling and institutional culture in greater detail. So that is where we will be going next. And thank you, Dalton. Dalton just put information in the chat about the conference and about the upcoming PD. And then I put together some resources for you. So the current ICCB system rules manual, I put that one in there. ESG, that's kind of the national model that we modified for the Illinois model. And then I also gave you a list of Harvard Business Review articles that talk about stakeholders, jobs to be done, and this idea of co-creation. Okay. Whew. So what, I know we're exactly at time. What questions do you have for me? Okay. And as always, that's my cell phone and my email. So if you think of something after we hang up today, definitely just give me a shout. Thank you all for your participation today. As always, you were great. And I'll be reaching out soon to do some technical assistance with some of you. If you don't get an email from me and you are interested in pursuing technical assistance or you have specific questions, just give me an email or give me a call.